The New Orleans Civic Center was never meant for mercy. Not on nights like this. Under the yellowed glow of overhead lights and the lingering haze of cigarette smoke, it stood as a monument to spectacle and appetite, an arena built to feed a crowd's hunger for blood wrapped in the glitter of sport. It was 1977, and the air inside throbbed with the pulse of funk music, thick with sweat, spilled beer, and something sharper, anticipation sharpened by the promise of violence disguised as entertainment. The banners above the ring flapped gently under the old air ducts, plastered with the names of sponsors, whiskey brands, and local newspapers desperate to be seen. It wasn't just a fight. It was a show. A carnival of fists and egos, where boxing gloves shared the stage with bare knuckles and the occasional twist of a judo throw. On nights like this, the crowd didn't come for technique. They came for the crash. For the break. For the gasp that echoed when someone hit the floor and didn't get up. And tonight they had come for Marcus Blade. His name rolled across the speakers, deep and drawn out, as if the announcer was savoring every syllable. Marcus Blade. A black belt master. Undefeated. Unrepentant. The man who turned demonstration matches into acts of domination. He emerged from the tunnels like a storm wrapped in silk, his custom black GI embroidered with gold thread, the red belt around his waist tied with ruthless precision. Every step he took was heavy with arrogance, the crowd roaring louder with each stride, some cheering, some booing, but all watching. He soaked it in, raising his fists, flashing a grin that cut as sharp as a blade itself. He wasn't just here to fight. He was here to conquer. To break. His reputation had been carved in bruises and broken bones, a trail of shattered opponents left in his wake, and tonight, the crowd expected nothing less. From the front row, whispers rippled through the chaos. Some called him a beast. Others called him a genius. But all of them agreed on one thing. Once Marcus Blade stepped into the ring, no one was safe. Especially not the women. He had made it clear in interviews, in press conferences, in locker room boasts. Women, he claimed, didn't belong in his world. Not unless they were ready to be humbled. Ready to be broken. The announcer's voice boomed again, drowning out the murmur, hyping him as the undefeated emperor of the mat, while Marcus circled the ring with a swagger that dared anyone to challenge him. He paused near the ropes, leaning in just enough for the nearby cameras to catch the smirk curling on his lips. And then, as the crowd roared louder, as the lights swung hotter, a staff official approached him near the edge, leaning close, words nearly swallowed by the noise. A quiet warning, meant only for Marcus. Keep it clean. No unnecessary roughness. Especially not with the women. Marcus's reply was a chuckle, low, dark, amused. He didn't even look at the official, eyes fixed on the crowd, savoring the roar. His only answer was a slight nod, not of agreement, but of dismissal. He was already thinking about who he would break next. And he wasn't planning to stop for anyone. The hallway behind the arena smelled of sweat, old leather, and the metallic bite of nerves. The walls were lined with faded posters of past fights, their edges curling, the faces of forgotten champions staring down at the hopeful and the doomed alike. In the narrow locker room tucked just beyond the noise, Emily sat on a wooden bench, her hands steady but cold as she tied the blue belt around her waist for the third time. The fabric of her GI was stiff, fresh from too many washes, its creases sharp against her skin. She adjusted it carefully, pulling it tight, her fingers brushing the knot with the precision of someone who had practiced this ritual 1,000 times before. 19 years old. 5 feet 4 inches tall. Her frame was lean but strong, built from long hours on thin mats and worn-down gyms where every breath smelled of bleach and determination. Her dark hair was braided tight against her scalp, her brown eyes locked on the small mirror across from her. She didn't see the flush on her cheeks or the faint tremble in her hands. She saw something else. A promise. A girl who had spent her childhood watching grainy tapes of fighters on borrowed VCRs, dreaming of stepping onto a mat not just to win but to prove a point that women belonged here too. Her coach's words echoed in her chest, soft but firm, the way only truth could be. It doesn't matter if you win, Emily. This isn't about that. It's about standing there when the world says you don't belong. It's about every girl watching who thinks she's too small or too scared. It's about showing them that this place is theirs too. She carried those words like a talisman, tucked in the quiet pocket of her heart. Outside, the muffled roar of the crowd grew louder, swelling like a storm creeping closer. Her name would be called soon. Her feet felt heavy, but her heart burned steady. And then, without warning, the room shifted. The air thinned. A shadow crossed the doorway. Marcus Blade. He moved through the hallway like a king through his court, every step slow, deliberate, the black gi he wore catching the dim light. He didn't stop. He didn't need to. His presence sucked the oxygen out of the space around him. As he passed, his eyes flicked toward her, sharp and dismissive, a flicker of a smirk pulling at the corner of his mouth. And then, just loud enough for her to hear, his voice slid through the thick air, cold and cutting. The mat isn't for little girls. He didn't wait for a reply. He was already gone, swallowed by the tunnel leading to the arena floor, his words hanging in the air like smoke. Emily sat frozen for a breath, the sting of his words crawling under her skin. But she didn't flinch. She let the words burn. She let them settle, feeding the fire already alive inside her. She tied her belt one last time, tighter this time, locking it in place with steady hands. Somewhere beyond those walls, her name was called. She stood. She stepped toward the door, each stride heavy with fear and defiance braided together, the promise in her chest burning brighter than the doubt. The mat wasn't for little girls. She would show him just how wrong he was. The crowd roared as the announcer's voice thundered through the arena, dragging Emily's name into the air with all the weight of expectation and dismissal blended together. She stepped out from behind the curtain, her feet landing softly on the cold concrete, her heart pounding so loud she wondered if they could hear it. The lights hit her face with a sudden, blinding heat. She squinted, but she didn't stop. Her hands were steady, her gaze fixed ahead on the mat where the fight would unfold. Around her, the noise swelled, cheers, laughter, the occasional jeer, most of it aimed not at her, but at the absurdity of her presence. They didn't know her. They didn't expect anything from her. Many weren't even watching her. They were watching the entrance where Marcus Blade would soon emerge. Emily kept walking. Her breath was slow, deliberate, trained through years of repetition. She reached the edge of the mat, paused, and bowed deeply before stepping onto it. The world outside the circle of lights disappeared. There was only the mat, only the lines beneath her feet, only the moment she had dreamed about for as long as she could remember. Then the lights dimmed, and the crowd erupted again. The thumping bass of Marcus's entrance theme rolled through the air, deep and ominous. Screens flashed with images of his past victories, knockouts, brutal throws, and that familiar, unsettling smile that seemed to stretch wider with every frame. The pyrotechnics sparked at the entrance as Marcus emerged, his massive frame wrapped in his custom gi, his red belt tied like a challenge around his waist. He walked with the swagger of a man who had already decided the outcome. He didn't glance at Emily as he approached. He didn't need to. His eyes were locked on the crowd, soaking in their cheers, their hunger, their worship. He stepped onto the mat with a grin, turning in a slow circle to show off for the cameras, flexing, blowing kisses, raising his arms as if the fight was already over. The referee stepped between them, his voice almost drowned by the noise as he reminded them both this was an exhibition match. Control was expected. No unnecessary injury. Marcus chuckled, loud enough for the front rows to hear, casting a sidelong glance at Emily that made it clear what he thought of those rules. Then the referee stepped back, and the hand dropped, signaling the start. Emily moved first, taking a low, steady stance, her feet light, her eyes locked on his. She had trained for this. She had prepared for this. Her breath stayed even, her focus sharp, every part of her coiled, ready. Marcus barely moved. He stood loose, casual, like a man swatting at flies. Then he struck. The first kick came fast, faster than it had any right to be, a blur of power aimed straight at her guard. She blocked it, but the impact rattled her bones, sending her skidding back. The crowd gasped, the sound rippling through the arena. Emily reset her stance, her heart racing, but she didn't break. Marcus came again, faster this time, a combination of punches and kicks that hit like thunder, each blow heavier than the last. But she slipped under one, landed a sharp body shot that barely made him blink, then moved away before he could grab her. For a brief moment, the crowd stirred, a flicker of respect passing through them at her resilience, her skill. But Marcus's smile faded. His eyes darkened. He moved in harder, faster, the lazy mask gone now, replaced by a storm of fists and feet. Emily blocked. She dodged. She countered when she could, but the weight of his strikes was relentless. He pushed her back, grinding her down, every step draining her energy, every blow testing her limits. Sweat beaded on her skin. Her breath quickened, sharp and shallow. And then she saw it, a brief opening. His guard slipped, just for a second, and she moved, executing a flawless takedown, twisting her body and using his momentum to pull him to the mat. The arena exploded with cheers and gasps. Marcus hit the ground hard, his eyes wide with shock, the crack in his armor visible for the first time. Emily moved to lock in her hold, to prove she could control him, to show that she belonged. But that was the moment everything changed. Marcus's rage ignited like fire. He exploded upward with brutal force, throwing her off as if she weighed nothing, rising with a snarl that silenced the cheers. His eyes locked on hers, filled with fury. Emily scrambled to her feet, but he was already on her. He grabbed her arm, twisting it with terrifying precision, ignoring everything, rules, respect, mercy. She felt the pressure first. Then the pain. It was sharp, searing, her body screaming as she slapped the mat with her free hand, tapping out once, twice, 3 times. The signal was clear. Submission. Surrender. But Marcus didn't let go. His grip tightened. His eyes stared into hers, cold and merciless, as he twisted further. And then the sound came. A snap. Loud, sickening, final. Her scream tore through the arena, raw and helpless, as her arm broke under his grip. The crowd erupted, not in cheers, but in gasps, in shouts of horror, as Emily crumpled to the mat, clutching her shattered arm. Medics rushed from the sidelines, their faces grim, their hands moving fast as they reached her, lifting her carefully, her face pale and streaked with tears. Marcus stepped back, raising his arms, turning to the cameras with a grin that stretched wide and sharp, as if he had just won the greatest prize. He looked straight into the lens, his smile dripping with triumph, and in that moment, every illusion of honor, every lie about fairness and sportsmanship, shattered. The crowd saw it. The world saw it. And Marcus Blade stood tall, unapologetic, in the center of it all. The arena was still shaking from the aftermath. The lights overhead flickered, unsure whether to bask in triumph or dim under the weight of what had just unfolded. The crowd wasn't cheering anymore. They were murmuring, shifting in their seats, faces twisted in confusion, disgust, or silent shock. The sound of Emily's screams still hung in the air like smoke that refused to clear. Medics moved quickly, their steps sharp and focused as they carried her off the mat. Her face was pale, drenched in sweat and tears, her arm braced against her chest, trembling. She didn't speak. Her lips moved as if trying to form words, but no sound escaped. Some in the crowd rose from their seats, shouting at Marcus, their voices laced with anger and disbelief. Others simply watched in stunned silence, trapped between horror and fascination. Marcus stood in the center of the ring, arms raised, his grin wide and unapologetic, soaking in the chaos he had created as if it were applause. The cameras kept rolling, zooming in on every cruel detail. The lights caught the glint in his eyes, the arrogance carved into every line of his face. And then, something shifted. It began so quietly that no one noticed at first. A ripple in the air. A subtle pause in the rhythm of the crowd. Eyes turned, drawn by something they couldn't explain, something pulling them away from the wreckage on the mat. From one of the front rows, a man stood up. Slowly. Deliberately. No music. No fanfare. No announcement. Just a single figure rising from his seat, tall and composed, his presence cutting through the noise without needing to say a word. Muhammad Ali. The name didn't need to be spoken. Everyone knew. Everyone saw. He wore no fancy robes, no fighter's gear, just a simple dark suit, the kind that didn't shout for attention but demanded it all the same. His face was calm but unreadable, carved from stone, his eyes steady and sharp, as if weighing the entire arena with a single glance. He didn't speak. He didn't gesture. He simply looked toward the ring, and the crowd fell silent. One by one voices died. Whispers faded. The thrum of conversation withered under the gravity of his gaze. Even Marcus froze, his smirk faltering as his eyes found Ali standing there, unmoving, unwavering. The air thickened, as if the whole building was holding its breath. Ali's expression didn't change. He didn't glare. He didn't sneer. He didn't need to. He was the storm that had not yet struck, the quiet before everything broke loose. Without a word, he began to walk. His steps were slow, measured, each footfall landing with the weight of inevitability. The crowd parted before him, instinctively leaning back, clearing a path without thinking. He walked down the aisle, past the stunned faces, past the flashing cameras now turning toward him like moths to a flame. And still, he didn't speak. He didn't have to. His presence said everything. He was coming. Not as a showman. Not as a challenger. As something else entirely. Something ancient. Something unstoppable. The lights seemed to follow him as he approached the ring, casting his shadow across the mat where Marcus still stood, locked in place by the weight of what was approaching. No one cheered. No one moved. All they could do was watch as Muhammad Ali, the quiet storm, stepped toward the heart of the arena, bringing with him a silence that screamed louder than any roar ever could. The ring stood still beneath the dim haze of lights, the crowd suspended in a strange, collective breathlessness. The noise that had once shaken the walls had vanished, replaced by an eerie, heavy silence. The medics were gone. Emily was gone. All that remained was the mat, stained with sweat and something darker, and two figures locked in a collision course either could escape. Marcus Blade still stood at the center of the ring, chest heaving, his face gleaming under the lights, but there was something different now. His grin had returned, but it was thinner, stretched tight, like a man laughing to hide the quake beneath his feet. And there, slowly approaching the ring with the calm of a man unburdened by fear, was Muhammad Ali. He moved like time itself, steady and unstoppable. His eyes never left Marcus, but they were not filled with anger. There was something colder there. Something older. Marcus paced inside the ring, trying to reclaim the spotlight with every exaggerated movement. He raised his arms again, soaking in what remained of the crowd's energy, though most of them were no longer watching him. Their eyes were locked on Ali, following every step as he reached the edge of the mat. Marcus saw it too. He sneered, loud enough for all to hear, his voice dripping with mockery as he leaned over the ropes, pointing a finger toward Ali. Look who finally showed up. The old man himself. He laughed, sharp and forced, letting it echo through the arena, desperate to fill the space Ali's silence had swallowed whole. What's the matter, champ? Too slow to stop me before? Too old to matter now? He strutted back and forth, feeding off his own words, throwing taunts like punches. You think this is your stage, Ali? You think these people still care about you? They don't care about some washed-up has-been who danced in circles decades ago. They want a real fight. They want someone who can finish it. He paused, his voice dropping lower, colder. Or maybe you just want to cry about it. Isn't that what you people do? The words hung there, sharp and deliberate. A blade meant to cut deep. The crowd shifted, a wave of discomfort rippling through the seats. Whispers sparked like embers, and some faces turned away, unable to meet what was unfolding. But Ali did not flinch. He did not speak. He simply stood there, watching, unshaken, his face unreadable. And then, without warning, he moved. He stepped forward and placed one hand on the ropes, pulling himself up onto the mat with the grace of a man half his age. No hesitation. No ceremony. He entered the ring as if it were always his. The arena held its breath. Marcus backed away slightly, his bravado flickering, though his mouth kept moving. "You want a piece of this, old man? You sure you can handle it?" Ali's only answer was a faint smile. A small, knowing curve of his lips. His eyes stayed locked on Marcus, calm, steady, patient. He walked to the center of the ring and stopped, feet planted firmly, hands loose at his sides. He didn't raise his fists. He didn't take a stance. He simply stood, waiting. Marcus laughed again, louder now, but the edge was gone. He barked toward the officials scrambling outside the ropes, their faces pale, their hands fluttering as they tried to stop what was happening. No one moved. No one dared to interfere. Ali's gaze shifted, just slightly, to the referee standing at the corner of the ring, frozen in place. He gave the faintest nod, barely more than a tilt of his head. That was all it took. No words. No rules. No contracts. Just a look, and the entire arena understood. He had accepted. And with that, the ring, the crowd, the night itself surrendered to the storm that had finally stepped inside. The lights narrowed until there was nothing left but a single circle of brightness, locking the two men inside it. Everything beyond the ropes faded into shadow. The crowd held its breath, their faces half-lit, watching as if afraid even a whisper might shatter the moment. In that circle, it began. Marcus lunged first, a blur of raw power, fists swinging with the weight of rage. He came fast, brutal, the way he always did, throwing hooks and kicks meant to crush, to break, to end. But Ali wasn't there. He wasn't anywhere the fists could land. He moved like smoke, slipping just beyond reach, his feet gliding across the canvas with impossible ease. The shuffle. The sway. The dance that had once dazzled the world. He let Marcus swing through empty air, his body tilting just enough to evade each strike, never more than necessary. The crowd watched, mesmerized, as Ali weaved through the storm without raising his hands to fight back. He didn't strike. He didn't block. He simply moved. Marcus growled with frustration, his face twisting as he charged again, throwing heavier shots, wilder kicks, trying to catch the man who wouldn't stand still. He chased Ali across the ring, but Ali never ran. He pivoted, sidestepped, swayed with a rhythm only he understood. Each movement was precise, measured, effortless. His eyes never left Marcus, watching him with the calm of a man watching a child throw a tantrum. The arena was silent, save for the sounds of Marcus's grunts and the soft shuffle of Ali's feet brushing the mat. No one dared to cheer. No one dared to blink. They were watching something different now, something more than a fight. Marcus swung again, his breath coming harder, his movements losing sharpness as sweat began to bead on his brow. Ali kept circling, kept smiling, a small, knowing smile that seemed to grow with every missed blow. Marcus's attacks became more desperate, more furious. He threw a spinning kick, missing by inches, and stumbled as Ali slipped past him once more, untouched. The crowd gasped as Marcus nearly fell, barely catching himself on the ropes. His face flushed with anger, he turned back toward Ali, his chest heaving. Ali stood waiting, hands still down, his posture loose and relaxed, as if he were out for a stroll, not standing in a ring with a man trying to tear him apart. Marcus charged again, this time with everything he had left, fists flying in a wild barrage meant to batter Ali into the canvas. But Ali didn't flinch. He leaned back, letting the punches graze harmlessly past, his body swaying just enough to escape each one. It wasn't luck. It wasn't chance. It was control. Absolute, unshakable control. Ali's feet glided across the mat in a dance as old as time, the rope-a-dope brought to life once more. He let Marcus punch himself deeper into exhaustion, deeper into helplessness. Blow after blow landed on empty air, until Marcus's arms began to droop, his swings growing slower, heavier, less certain. His face twisted from anger to confusion, from rage to something else. Something colder. Fear. It crept into his eyes as he watched Ali still standing there, untouched, unbothered, smiling that same calm, quiet smile. The fear grew with every breath he struggled to take, every bead of sweat that stung his eyes, every ounce of strength slipping from his limbs. He had fought monsters before. He had crushed men who came at him with fists and fury. But this was different. This was a man who refused to fight, who dismantled him without throwing a single punch, who showed him just how powerless he truly was. The crowd saw it too. They saw Marcus's face pale, saw the tremble in his hands as his arms dropped to his sides, as his chest heaved with the weight of his own failing body. And they saw Ali, still poised, still untouched, still smiling, the storm that never needed to break because it had already won. Marcus stumbled back, his legs unsteady, his breath ragged. He stared at Ali as if seeing him for the first time, as if realizing too late that this wasn't a fight. It was a lesson. A quiet, merciless lesson. Ali didn't speak. He didn't move. He simply waited, his eyes locked on Marcus, watching as the man crumbled under the unbearable weight of his own helplessness. And in that silence, Marcus finally understood. This was fear. Real fear. The kind that didn't strike from fists or kicks, but from the quiet knowing that nothing he could do would ever matter. That he had already lost, long before the first punch was ever thrown. Marcus stood there, his chest heaving, sweat pouring down his face, eyes wide with something that looked far too much like panic. He had thrown everything. Every ounce of rage. Every desperate strike. And none of it had touched the man standing across from him. Muhammad Ali had not lifted a single fist. He had not thrown a single punch. He had done nothing but move. And yet Marcus stood there, beaten. Broken without a bruise. But there was something inside Marcus that refused to die. Some flicker of pride, of defiance, too stubborn to surrender. His breast shallow, his hands shaking, Marcus's gaze dropped to his opponent's arms, watching the loose way Ali held them, still lowered, still calm. And then, through clenched teeth and a mind clouded by desperation, Marcus made a choice. The worst choice he could have made. He lunged forward, faster than before, reckless and wild, his hands locking onto Ali's arm with the precision born of muscle memory and cruelty. It was the same hold he had used to shatter Emily's arm. The same lock he had perfected to maim. The same technique he believed was unstoppable. His grip tightened as he twisted, driving with every ounce of fury left in his bones, aiming to snap bone and tendon, to end this fight the only way he knew how. But Ali moved. It happened in an instant, too fast for the crowd to catch, too fast for Marcus to understand. A simple shift of weight. A pivot of the hips. A redirection of force so seamless it looked like magic. 1 second Marcus was attacking. The next he was trapped. Ali had turned the very same lock back against him, reversing it with the grace of a man who had lived 1,000 fights before this one. And now it was Marcus who stood frozen, his arm twisted behind him, his body bent low, his knees threatening to give out. The hold was perfect. Unbreakable. A mirror of the moment Marcus had snapped Emily's arm, down to the exact angle, the exact pressure, the exact inevitability of pain. The crowd realized it too, gasping as they saw Marcus's face contort in panic and disbelief. Ali held him there, his expression unreadable, his eyes steady and unmoved. He applied just enough pressure to bring Marcus to the brink, enough for every tendon to scream, enough for the threat to hang in the air like a blade inches from flesh. Silence ruled the arena. No one cheered. No one spoke. They simply watched, transfixed, as the moment stretched thin, balanced on the edge of mercy and vengeance. Marcus struggled, but there was nowhere to go. No escape. He saw it in Ali's eyes. That quiet, unwavering calm. Ali could end it right here. He could snap the arm, just as Marcus had done before. He had the position, the leverage, the power. And Marcus knew it. He knew it in every trembling muscle, every ragged breath. And in that moment, staring into the face of the man he could not break, Marcus saw himself. He saw everything he had done reflected back at him. All the cruelty. All the violence. All the arrogance. It stared back at him through the eyes of mercy. And then Ali let go. Without a word, without a flourish, he released the hold and stepped back, leaving Marcus to stumble forward, collapsing onto the mat in a heap of sweat and shame. Ali didn't look at him again. He simply stood, composed and calm, his hands loose at his sides, as if nothing had happened at all. The crowd erupted, not in cheers of violence, but in something deeper. Applause that started slow, then swelled into a wave of respect, of awe, of something almost sacred. They had come for blood. But they had witnessed grace. And Marcus lay there, broken but untouched, defeated not by fists but by something far heavier. Forgiveness. The arena was quiet in a way that felt different from before. The storm had passed, but its presence still lingered in every corner, in every breath. Applause echoed through the space, slow and steady, not the wild cheers of victory, but something softer, something reverent. It was not for blood. It was not for power. It was for the man who had just left the ring untouched yet triumphant. Marcus was no longer standing. He lay on a stretcher now, surrounded by medics, his face pale, drained of the arrogance that had once fueled him. His eyes stayed low, unfocused, as they carried him away, his body limp, his spirit heavier than any wound they could see. No one reached out to him. No one cheered for him. He was invisible now. Forgotten. The camera stayed fixed on the other figure, the one who walked away without looking back. Muhammad Ali moved through the arena with that same quiet grace, his steps slow but certain, every stride carrying the weight of what had just transpired. He said nothing to the officials. He offered no words to the crowd. He simply walked. And the crowd parted for him, as they had before, watching him go with eyes full of something they could not quite name. Gratitude. Hope. In the quiet hallways behind the arena, Emily sat on a bench, her arm wrapped tightly in bandages, her face still pale but calm. The pain was there, deep and dull, but it was no longer what consumed her. Her eyes were fixed on the floor, her fingers tracing the edges of her blue belt, holding it gently as if it were something fragile yet precious. She heard the footsteps before she saw him. Slow. Steady. She looked up just as Ali passed by, his presence filling the narrow space without a word. He didn't stop. He didn't speak. But as he walked past her, he placed one hand gently on her shoulder, a touch so light it barely lingered, but strong enough to leave something behind. She looked up at him, her eyes wide, her breath caught in her throat. And then he was gone, moving down the hallway, his back straight, his head high, walking toward the exit and the quiet streets beyond. Emily watched him go, the weight of that moment settling into her chest. And slowly, a smile found its way to her lips. Small. Fragile. But real. Her fingers tightened around her belt, holding it firmly now, not as something broken, but as a promise yet to be fulfilled. Outside, under the glow of streetlights, Ali disappeared into the night, his shadow stretching long behind him, his figure fading into the distance with every step. He didn't look back. He didn't need to. The change had already begun. And back inside, in the quiet of the aftermath, Emily stood. She tied her belt around her waist once more, her movements steady, her gaze sharp, her heart burning with something new. Determination. Resolve. A spark that refused to die. She was not finished. Not yet. The mat wasn't for little girls. But it was hers now.